We are live. People are going to be trickling in very slowly, I imagine. So what I'm going to do is speak very slowly with the introduction. So first of all, hello and welcome to everyone out there in Zoom land. This is the Utah Poetry Festival 2022. We're still virtual, but there are also events that are going on statewide and month-long that are in person. I'm Paisley Rekdal, your state poet laureate, and today's panel's host and moderator. And I'm delighted to open up this weekend's core festival events with today's craft session, specifically around artist books. And I'd like to begin by also acknowledging that this event is taking place virtually on the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes, and Utah is home to 8 distinct tribal nations. I'd like to thank our sponsors, the Utah Division of Arts and Museums and the Utah Humanities Council, for making these events possible. And again, I'd like to thank all of you for coming and supporting poetry on a Saturday morning. If you're interested in today's event, I know you're going to be interested in many more of our virtual craft talks taking place today. After this panel will be one on line and stanza. There will be one on multimodal poems, so making poems out of mapping projects or video poems or poems that use technology in a variety of different ways. If you're interested in artist books, I think that's a natural fit for you. So you would also probably be interested in our headline reading tonight at 7 p.m., which is also taking place virtually. John Belk, Danielle Dubrasky, and Nancy Tekacs, all poets from Southern Utah, will be reading from their just published collections. You can register for that reading and all the craft talks I've just mentioned at our website, www.utahpoetryfestival.com, which we'll be putting in the chat. I'll also put the schedule link in the chat for all of you to see the other talks today and the events that are going on statewide the rest of this month. All registration and location information can be found via that link. Today's speakers all have books, and we have a wonderful virtual book fair going on. So I'm going to be putting the link to our book fair into the chat throughout this session to remind you to support us all by purchasing books. You can't just sit here and enjoy your life, you must pay. Today's session is a largely informal conversation between the panelists. To ask questions, please use the question and answer feature. To sing our panelists' praises, please use the chat feature. I will be handling the questions and reading them out to our panelists as needed. So that's the housekeeping for this order. I just want to read our panelists' bios in alphabetical order. First up, Kathryn Cowles. That is Cowles, right? Not Cowles. Right, I remember this now. Kathryn Cowles was born in Provo, Utah, and lived there for much of her childhood, aside from a few years in Chicago and a stint in London. She studied at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City, earning her BA in English and print journalism, MA in British and American literature, and PhD in creative writing with an emphasis in poetry. She edited Red Magazine and co-edited the poetry section of Quarterly West. Cowles' first book of poetry, Eleanor, Eleanor, Not Your Real Name, won the Dorothy Brunsman Poetry Prize, the City Weekly Poetry Book Prize for 2009, and the University of Utah's Graduate Research Award. Her newest book, Maps and Transcripts of the Ordinary World, out from Milkweed Editions, won the Larry Levis Academy American Poets Prize, selected by Cole Swenson. She currently teaches at Hobart and William Smith colleges. Craig Dworkin is the author of over a dozen poetry books and chapbooks, including most recently 12 Erroneous Displacements and a Fact and The Pinewoods Notebook. Dworkin is also the editor of a half dozen volumes, including Against Expression, an anthology of conceptual writing. He lives in Salt Lake City, where he teaches literary history and theory at the University of Utah and serves as founding editor to Eclipse. Finally, but not least, of course, Nathan Hauke. Nathan is the author of Indian Summer Recycling, Every Living One, In the Marble of Your Animal Eyes, and 4 chapbooks. His poems have been anthologized in Hick Poetics and the Arcadia Project, North American Postmodern Pastoral. So we're going to start with Craig and then move to Nathan with the question of what is an artist book exactly and what relationship do they have with poetry? So I will mute myself and.
Thank you, Paisley. Really proud to be in this company. I thought it started us off really short and concise, and then we can complicate things and disagree with it. But I go back to the definition that Johanna Drucker made, and she phrases it in a couple ways. One of them is that an artist's book is a book that's created as an original work of art rather than a reproduction of a pre-existing work. And then a little more conceptually to say that it integrates the formal means of its realization and its production, which is to say its structure, its formal elements. It integrates those with its thematic or its aesthetic issues, so that the form, the structure, the elements of its material manifestations are themselves part of what the book is about, part of what the text is about. And then I'll let Nathan complicate that for us.
Thanks, Craig. And it's, again, an honor to be here with everyone. I love this festival, and it's really fun to be on a panel with Paisley and Craig and Kathryn. I want to think a little bit about, I'm going to screen share here, and I want to think a little bit about the idea of rethinking the page in particular. Let's see. Can everybody see my screen? Okay, great. So I continue to find that I'm most interested in poems that ally themselves with process, accumulation, and/or decomposition, keep faith, and establish a tentative kinship with a greater activity that's essentially elsewhere. How do poems begin to gesture towards the greater part that's elsewhere? I'm learning there are plenty of ways. It depends on how you're looking and how attached you are to any expectations about what you think poems should be doing and how you think they should interact with the page. Imaginations of the page, layered by all of our expectations for and experiences of reading, fundamentally shape cultural imaginations of poetry, beginning with an imagination that pages are the habitat of poetry. They're not. Pages and poems ring in the wake of their occasions when what occasions them is elsewhere. They're always inevitably doing something else, and poems that are attuned to their occasions are operating in accordance with other imaginations of order. Their locus of meaning is active and it transgresses the page. I thought it might be fun to look at some ways of approaching poems as artifacts that came to process and possibility before and beyond the habits of pages. And so I want to just kind of like jump around to a lot of ideas, which I think we'll be able to circle in other ways as we keep going. Maybe clumsily navigate slides here. So work on Emily Dickinson by Susan Howe, Jen Bervin, Martha Werner reveals Emily Dickinson's proclivity to write on scraps of paper across the angles, edges, and flaps of envelopes. This book, Gorgeous Nothings, is revelatory for many reasons, including the fact that it makes truths that have often been locked down by Harvard more widely available. They reveal Dickinson's writing to be multi-directional in ways that complicate reading and the idea that a surface is one-sided, because when you're writing on an envelope, there's clearly an interior and an exterior that speak to each other across folds and edges. Cut-ups destabilize imaginations of order and reading, boggling perspective. They jar impositions we make as writers and readers, complicating where you leave off and I begin, which you can see in the Susan Howe page on the left. Restoring poems to another interval of process that allows for other possibilities. And this is on the Olson side. My beloved father, turning this page to the right to write. Hank Laser's improvisational shape writing does this too. How do you read, move through this? Always. It's a nonlinear experience that recognizes simultaneities, meditative rhythms of presence dispersing. Reading notebook entries remembers Olson's pun, initiating a tender shift in perspective, a physical change as you breathe, focus, and turn the book in your hands. Breathe, focus, and turn the book in your hands anew. Superpositions and erasures explore the way texts layer each other, sharing pages as they acknowledge the ways all writing occurs in conversation with other texts and that all pages are really connected to other pages. My grandmother planted a beautiful ginkgo tree in the yard that I grew up in. And one of the first ways I responded to her death in 2011 was to move through the description of the Audubon provided for the ginkgo tree, circling the letters that spell Kathryn. Later, I came back and circled the letters that spell grandmother. I really can't remember how it ended up taking the shape that it's taken, only that it has continued to break down in a way that corresponds with grief and the effects of time, memory, erasure, entropy, and decomposition. My grandfather, Keith, came home from working as a mechanic in a power plant to read Emerson and Peanuts cartoons in his studies surrounded by paper. I raised a paper birch for him when he died two years later. Speaking of memorializing, poems are necessarily elegiac. They're fossils of experiences. A poem on a page might account for a nexus of experience, X amount of time, circling the habit of meaning, etc. But time and experience continue. Meaning does. Recognizing the fact that poems and pages are at a deficit helps us remember the way they should always give precedence to the greater activity they'll return to. It's more of a disposition and earnestness, I guess, that's important to me. It's also worth saying that absence gives definition to presence. Watching the glitched reflection of trees and current reveals an important truth. Being is dynamic. Forms we encounter in poems on pages are temporary. Process is the only constant. Matzo Batso's visit to a holy shrine on Mount Nico in the narrow road to the deep north, amidst the experience of the shrine itself, creating an enclosure, a whole in its narrative that respects the sacredness of the interaction he has there. To say more about the shrine would be to violate its holiness. In this sense, the narrow to the deep north becomes a shrine by omission, unmade at the focal point of its journey, of the journey it compasses. Basho knows better than to try to stand the experience on edge by committing it to writing at all. It's not symbolic and it can't be shared. He and his traveling companions are vibrating with feeling. The page is always happily at a loss. A book is. I'm going to kick things over to Kathryn. I know that I jumped all over the place. So.
Okay, I'm going to try and jump in places that weren't already jumped to there and kind of do it on no, I think it's perfect. I mean, one thing that occurs to me as I look through all of those gorgeous images and, you know, things like Niedeker's calendar poems feel like I love to stretch the definition of what counts as an artist book and to like hold a whole bunch of things in it. And it's kind of a fraught term. Sometimes people fight over where the apostrophe goes and what can kind of count and what can fit into it. But I like really inclusive things. And I think of the wild variety of things. When I was doing my exams, my doctoral exams at Utah, which has a beautiful book arts collection in the special collections, I remember interacting with all kinds of things that counted as books, including, like, I remember a Julie Chen, who is, I think of her as, you know, she's a poet and other things, but I love her book bindings. And I remember this book that had like hands that went back and forth as you turned it. And I was in the special collections, and it had instructions like, you need to wear this as a hat, and you need to wear it as like a Shakespearean cuff because it kind of like ruffled out. And so I started doing it, and people rushed over and said, no, you're not, you're not supposed to do that with the book. And I said, no, look, it says right here, that's what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to wear it as a hat. Or a scroll, which is an ancient book form. There's a scroll with Susan B. and Allen Ginsberg did a collaboration, and I made them set like 3 tables up side by side so that I could read the whole thing at once and then kind of roll it up into bits. But that interactive quality that Nathan was talking about, turning the page and then turning the page again, and the intimacy also of a book, of having it right in front of you and you're the person reading it. I think of those as qualities of artists' books. But then there are some that are sculptural. I think of Brian Detmer's books that are glued shut and then little bits are cut out of them, but it's not, you can't open it and read it as a book. There's a sculptural element to it. And so there are letterpress based books. There are kind of bookbinding emphasis books. There are books that are entirely painted pages, one-off books where you have to, that have a real aura to them, where you have to have the physical copy. And there's only one of them and you get to be the one looking at it. Or I just went to the Philadelphia Art Museum and saw the Duchamp exhibit that I've wanted to see for years for the first time there, and saw one of the valises in a box where you have these scattered notes that are all just kind of collected together along with miniaturized versions of a lot of the famous Duchamp art pieces like the urinal or like the Nude Descending a Staircase. And the scattered notes are a kind of a book, you know, and they're not bound together, but they operate in a book sort of form, or bring a museum into a box form so that you can kind of, you know, walk through the museum individually and look at it in a kind of a tiny way. So all of these things I want to wrap up in the term of artist book and include and call to. And I would just, as a side note, say, as a poet, for me, I remember, I think actually it was Craig who introduced me to Tom Phillips's Humument, which was one of my first kind of introductions to a different treatment of page and of book. And I remember being just shocked and made totally dizzy by the thought that you could do that was a thing that you could. And Tom Phillips, I wish that I brought my copy, paints the pages, does an erasure of pages of this book, this same book, pages over and over of it, but paints things out and leaves words and leaves like little bits in the gutter to kind of turn each individual page into an artwork. And that one is interestingly not, he doesn't have a book that you look through. It's more like you either buy the bound copy with individual pages. Is Brenda posting it? Thank you, Brenda. Brenda's posting a link to it, and go and look at it for a second while I'm talking. But one of the things that I loved about that book, it was really important to me for a long time. I don't really look at it anymore. I think about it that much. I teach it sometimes, but it was important to me as a permission giving text. And I often visit classes. I have some kind of cut out poems and poem photograph things in my books. And when I visit classes, one of the things I like to do is say to people, you have permission to make an artist book. And so that's something I want to say to everybody here, is that you don't have to be an artist or consider yourself an artist. You don't have to be a poet. You don't have to be any of these things. In fact, it's a really democratic form and anybody can do it. Anybody can make a book into a thing, and you're allowed to. And in fact, you probably should. For me, it was really important to me when the poet Eleni Sikilianos had read some of my work. She came to Utah and had kind of workshopped some of my poems. And she had been writing the book Body Clock, which she wrote when she was pregnant, and she was trying to account for the weirdness of time and the effect of it on your body. So she started drawing pictures of minutes and like doing little dots on them, and then drawing, thank you, is that, oh, Paisley, great. Or drawing little sketches and kind of expanding them, and then writing little poems around the side of them. And part of it was trying to find a form to wrestle with a kind of unsayable thing, an impossible to say thing, and trying to find a form to hold it. And the form kind of came about organically. And she told me that she didn't think that she was writing poems at the time. She just was trying to account for this thing, trying to get it to stick to the page somehow. And then I met with her and talked to her about it. And she said, Kathryn, you can do that too. You know, I'd been using other people's work in my first book, including Brenda's, who just posted it. I'd been using other people's work. And then she said, no, you should try this too. And it was a really important moment for me. So I like to pass that along. You can do it too, and you should. That's all for now.
Well, great. I have so many questions, and I'm going to try and combine two of them based on some of the things that Nathan and also Kathryn pointed out around. We think about what artist books challenge and the ways in which they're expanding maybe sort of our conventional reading practices, that they seem to be about reminding us of the materiality of language and a book, right? Which might be something we forget about in the ways that books are mass produced, actually. And here's a copy of Craig's book. But, you know, we might actually think of the book as a sort of a transparent object. We're only caring about the words printed on the page. But as you are all pointing out, we now have to care about how the words are manipulated, placed on a page, or erased on a page. And in that, it seems that artist books then make us aware of physicality, our own physicality in relation to the book. And also a question of time. Nathan, you said something that poems are necessarily elegiac, which brings me back to some ideas around photography, right? Which is that it's taken in a moment of time. So you're always thinking of something that's past, and maybe poems are always a record of the past. So thinking about time, materiality, I want to ask, is it possible to have a digital artist book? Or is an artist book have to be material in particular ways? And everyone's like,
Yes.
Yeah, sure.
I think absolutely.
Well, I'm gonna follow Kathryn. Let's be capacious, but also because and despite our zoomness here, the digital's material and physical just as much as pulped plant fibers are. I've got a liquid crystal here. So yeah, I can imagine a book that takes that form, that takes that structure as part of its essence. Sure.
I always connect time and digital space anyway. I think as a kid who grew up in the 80s, a lot of the things we loved the most were on VHS tapes. And we had like an early VCR, right? And we would play tapes just ad nauseum until they started to degrade. And so like our favorite movie at a certain point would start 10 minutes into the movie through the static, like, and so like, I'm always thinking about the fact that one of the things that I love the most about, or books that I love the most are books that tend to break down my imagination of what a book might be or how you might approach a book. And I guess in some ways that's what I want to think about with like rethinking the way we approach a page. Like the way we approach a page classifies imagination of poems, it classifies imagination of books. And so recognizing the fact that these things are going to break down in time frees them back up, I think, to me, and makes them available in a new, like, what's my favorite movie when I'm 8, when it starts 10 minutes in? It's different than it used to be. Like, like we're already walking down the street. I don't see the opening credits, you know, like it's a different experience.
And it's actually, this is something I've been wrestling with recently because I have started doing collages that are that involve a lot of kind of small elements, that like the cover of my book, which I didn't bring in here, but the cover of my book has one of these collages on it. And I was having a really hard time with these collages because I use really old paper, really brittle paper, and frequently you'll get wrinkles, or there are different, I've experimented with lots of different kinds of glues trying to get it to work. And part of the problem is I was trying to make it a physical book, and I was destroying collages at the end of the process while trying to seal them or try and had all these kind of heartbreaking experiences. And at some point, you know, I asked myself the question I always ask my hybrid forms students for my hybrid forms workshop, which is, what is the art piece? Is the art piece the actual collage that I'm doing when I intend to put it in the book or put it on the cover of the book? And in that case, I decided the art piece can be the printed copy of the book. And so I don't have to seal it or make it so that it will last. All that I have to do is get a digital version of it and then transform it into the digital version of the book, which is then printed into a physical copy of the book. And so that relaxation of nervousness of the physical copy of the book actually allows me to do a lot more wild things with my collages than if I have to make it bindable and make it holdable and make it last for a long time. And I think some of the art books that I have found to have, like, I bring in that sense of aura, because I think that Craig and I have wrestled with each other years and years ago about Benjamin and aura, who, you know, and he doesn't like aura, doesn't feel like you should have to have it, but I love aura and I love art museums and I love the one only thing. But I think sometimes you can digitally find a way to have aura, even though it's mass produced, or have that feeling of this is just me and this is just mine. I think of something like and
Nope.
Carson Knox.
Yeah.
Yeah, with that, or I have this little one right here, Mary Ruefle's A Little White Shadow, and it's this fantastic little tiny little erasure book, but you hold it and you get the sense of at least the echo of aura, of holding the actual thing, and you get to kind of go like this, and it's different than looking at hers online. Paisley's got one too. Yeah, and I've got Knox right here, and it's that gigantic accordion style binding, exactly that, where you feel the tangibility of, but there's no way to produce that. Nobody would get to see it except that she found a way to put it into book form, and then that becomes its. I have an example of my own work where the technical problems with the book form become really difficult, but I'll save that for later if it comes up.
Well, one thing.
Sorry,
Well,
Paisley.
no, go on, Nathan.
Well, I was gonna shift a little bit to think about the fact that a lot of artists, like if we think about like the book market, for example, like a lot of really beautiful artist books, there's no, I mean, I think it devalues pages to write poems on them, right? Artist books are there's no market for, a lot of publishers are not going to make, like, I have this thing right here in front of me that I don't know what to do with. Like, it's not even on like, how do you publish? What do you do with that? Like, but a lot of the weirdest books are only available in digital spaces. And I think it's probably worth acknowledging that too. Like, it's a lot cheaper to find some way to get things up in that, or share things in that way. And so there's this really great, I think, do-it-yourself guerrilla style scene for all kinds of really weird work that's happening that's only digital, and you can't get the copy unless you know the person and you can go and sit down with them and hold it. It's pretty, I don't know, it's maybe another dimension we want to circle back to or something.
Yeah, I mean, I want to get to a question that's in the Q&A feature, which segs to this, but I do want to note something really fascinating about what you're bringing up, which is that to a certain extent, once we think about shifting audience, is the artist book audience the audience of one? If it becomes the audience of many, then it becomes necessarily potentially a hybrid project between digital and material. And the fabrication is around that idea of preservation of aura, right? Like Carson's work. How do you make it feel as if you're touching something that was only produced for one, when in fact it was produced for many, and it had to be produced in these sorts of ways. So Callie writes, thinking about fossilization, in quotes, and the poem is record. I wonder about thinking about an artist book as perhaps more present, future oriented, since it imagines a future material interaction, returns the reader to their body in the moment of reading. It's a really great question. And again, it goes back to that question of audience. Does anyone want to speak to that? And I know Michael Berry's raised his hand. Michael, if you want to put a question in the Q&A, that'd be great. I can make sure to get to it.
I just want to show something like artist book as fossilization. This was something that I wanted to talk about anyway, but this Robert Smithson, this is not a good representation of it, because what you would need is the original version is kind of accordion style, was in, I think it was in Aspen, and came in a box with a bunch of other things, and you pull it out and it's accordion style, but it's about, it has, Cretaceous, Jurassic, Triassic, has all these periods, and it has like fossils in between, and then just stacks of information and bits of like museum language, museum placard language, quotations from different sources, all kind of smashed together. And I've often thought of that. I feel like it's influenced me in a way that's not visual in my own work, but conceptual, and definitely is interested in the past and presentness, and in the kind of smash that happens, and how that can be manifest physically.
Yeah.
That's an interesting thing to point to, also because entropy is so important to Smithson's process. So, like, thinking about futurity by pointing to somebody who's interested in entropy, like how does entropy fold back into an active process or a layer in active? Smithson's amazing.
Is the act of reading progressive or regressive in that sense, which is a fascinating thing. Like, does the artist book suggest, we think about maybe conventionally written or produced books as having a beginning, middle, and end, where there's a progression you follow to a kind of cathartic, maybe triumphal almost ending. But in fact, does the artist book want to work in reverse in that entropic? In fact, there's not going to be resolution. There's not going to be more information. In fact, we might, in Nathan's projects, you're taking things away actively, so that there's a kind of disappearance that speaks to the elegiac. That's probably more of a comment than a question, but I'm just kind of curious about, would you say artist books in general become entropic reading processes overall? I mean, Craig, what do you think? And about anything? That's a big question.
Yeah, no, I really, really liked Kelly's question, and I think that the other moment in time to think about is the kind of present moment. That if there's the memorial part of it, there's the archival part that imagines some future user, some future reader, but then there would also be conceiving of the book in the way that we sometimes people have sometimes described literature as the thing that you have to go back to, the thing you can't remember, get a lesson from, discard the text, but the thing that you have to be reading in the moment, not the thing you can digest and go away from. So you can't say, yeah, I've read Emily Dickinson. I know it now. I've got it. I don't have to open that book again. I have to be reading Emily Dickinson in that moment. We could think about books like that too, and that bodily, corporeal presence, I think, is a great, great point.
Yeah. I mean, I want to ask maybe a sort of strangely basic question around that, which is, all of you create artist books, and I'm wondering how you conceive of the reading and the audience that you are trying to reach and trying to create. And anyone who wants to take that. I mean, maybe no one wants to think about audience when they're creating these things, but I mean, Kathryn, you are obviously thinking about audience, because you're like, well, I'm trying to preserve this, if it did break down, if the collage did become a truly entropic mess, that would be, it sounds like a failure on your part. So you're clearly having some idea of audience and a particular kind of reading experience.
So I can bring my show and tell in now for this one. So I made this little book with my friend, the artist Kieran Maker, and she was in New Zealand, and she would send me things in the mail, and then I would collage things onto them and send them back to her. And we had this one that we made. She sent me this book with these like little watercolor paintings that would go over the page and then into the next page and like this. And so I went and added language and words onto them, and just kind of used my typewriter and cut little things out and stuck them in and that sort of thing. And then she came back from New Zealand, and we decided we wanted to make this into, there are lots of kind of fraught things happening with water in the Finger Lakes right now where I live. So we decided we wanted to make an edition of this so that we could sell it and give the money to some of the water rights organizations. And we had this grand idea, and we wanted to make it, in order to have the effect of this thing, we wanted to make it an accordion style book. So we started like trying to map it out. This is a funny version of things pasted together, but how could we make the whole thing like that and then fold it up? And we wanted to letterpress it. So we started making these editions where we digitized the water, and then we started printing them out, and then we digitized the words, because we had to like paste papers together. The logistics became really complicated really quickly. And then we started printing onto the copies of the water and realized that the press had been squishing our strange digitized version of the water. So it got longer and longer over there. It was kind of like a strange logistical nightmare to turn what was a single piece into a duplicate piece. And so right now we're working on making a tiny, tiny version of it where we could hold it all together. And I think we would probably make it digital and just print it. Like the other ones are neat, but the words don't go in the right place, and it kind of ruins the language of it. But so you have to think of audience when you are making something into an edition, and I have this other thing, like Nathan, I've got things that are hard to know how to duplicate, but I have this this sort of artist book thing that I'm working on with cutouts of women's, and I found this page of a magazine that had all these Rockette dancers in exactly the same pose, like with different dresses on. It was a dress advertisement. And so I started like cutting those out and then making duplicate cutouts of it and doing this sort of a thing. But I've had someone offer to publish it before, and who heard me read it at a reading, and I just thought, okay, but how can we, the page is too big. I designed it on this size of a page. It's a really hard size, but the type is small enough that if you made it smaller, you wouldn't be able to read it. And so the kind of the logistical complications, when I'm making something, I'm not often thinking, how shall my audience, deal with it? Another example of this is a poem from my second book, and it's called Paper with Tape. And part of like the joke of it is that I've cut out the exact same house and put it next to the other house, and I've taped it on. But and when you hold it, it's obvious, you can see the tape. But when we tried to print it in the book, you couldn't see the tape. So I had to like make a new version of it and like muck up the tape with my fingerprints and like get some stuff so that the tape becomes visible in a way that would be invisible before. So kind of changing when you shift something digital and then mass produce it becomes really tricky, as Nathan mentioned, and something you have to think about. I find if I think about it as I'm making the thing, it makes the thing inevitably much worse than it would be otherwise. But then it's a whole new, form can be 90% of the art piece sometimes.
Which I want to go to the chat super briefly, because Lisa Bickmore puts in a great comment here, which I think speaks again to some of the creative values and the reading values around artist books. Lisa writes, you have to think of the material constraints of production too. Editions are challenging. But what I think is fascinating about maybe what we could imagine as a conventional poem is that we imagine that those formal constraints are within the meanings and definitions of the words themselves, and that those formal constraints then get organized by, say, sound, rhyme, or repetition, whether it's a visual repetition of an image, or even, constructive meaning that way. But it seems that the kinds of ways you're talking about artist books, those constraints become amplified to the extreme. There's the constraint of material itself, a constraint of production, as well as constraints of conventional language that we see as either expressive or not expressive. And I'm curious about how much, that idea of the constraint is the thing that becomes the most interesting to you as producers of artist books. Is it something that is the primary draw for you, or is it just something you have to think about while you're making it?
I'm really interested in that, and I want to, I guess, backtrack and try and build back to that. So like, one of the things that I think is interesting, going back to what Kathryn was saying at the beginning, is like the idea of intimacy in artist books. And I think we're talking about like who the audience might be, at least in my experience, like the weirdest projects that are happening around me are usually involve a very small imagination of company. Like it's very intimate. It's like the company might just be me the next time I walk through the room. And I hope that it goes on to include other people. But essentially what happens as you go down that path, at a certain point, the question of like, how would I share something like this comes up? And then material constraints really, I think, start to become an interesting part of the conversation. Like, what would it look like to take these pages and put them together? Or how would you make these things happen on a page? How would you, like, it gets, I think those two things are probably connected, like that idea of intimacy and the material process of sharing or bringing it into a wider conversation. And I tend to be interested by the suspension there, and not really, I guess I'm interested in constraints also though. So like I like thinking through things in that way.
Yeah, the performance of different forms of intimacy too, through the artist book. Yeah. Craig, what were you going to say?
Well, I'm trying to think out loud here that something you said prompted me to think of back to our very first question about how we might define the artist book, and it might be useful for people to run this kind of thought experiment, kind of mental exercise, and take whatever your definition of poetry is, and project that or scale that up to its mode of production, to how it's printed, to how it gets to a reader. So if poetry is the literature in which every word matters. Let the book be that form in which all of the material matters. If poetry is language oriented away from its communicative function, scale that up. What would that mean for what you might hold in your hands or what you might look at in front of you if poetry is about constraint, poetry is about metaphor. Like what would it mean to hold something metaphorical? That might be a useful and productive definition of the artist's book. Can we project the poetics of the text onto its substrate?
So I want to push on that a little bit too, because, as we're talking about some of the difficulties of production for some of these things, and if we wanted to scale poetry up in all of its material resonances, there's also the material of money. And these are very precious objects. They get collected as well. The average person does not actually own many artist books because some of them are quite expensive. And so I'm kind of curious about the relationship. And even if there are artist books that have actually wanted to explode that idea of money as one of the unseen but constantly read things as part of poetry itself and the writing and the producing of poetry. Are there any texts that do that? Anyway, lots of questions just popped up. When money gets mentioned, people have things to say, but I'll throw that out as if anyone wants to take that one. No one wants to take that one.
I mean, I might just mention that it's something that concerns me so deeply that I can't bear to make a precious object. I have to have it duplicable. I have to, even if it means making my labor just outrageously outsized to, and this is not to downplay the fact that, I mean, I feel like anybody who works in letterpress, anybody who makes fine artist books, they're going to be selling it for far less than it's worth in terms of labor. So even if it is really expensive, it still probably was more expensive to make. And so that kind of, I really like when sometimes artists like to capture the fact of the outsized relationship between labor and product. Like I think of Andrea Deso, who I really love, who does like embroideries and different things like that. She did an embroidery animation. So each bit of the animation was a piece of embroidery that, so I love it because embedded, and then you look at the animation and you see it moving, but you realize that kind of outsized, it would be so much easier just to draw it. And she could have drawn it, but she animates it using embroidery in part just to show the outsized amount of labor that goes into that sort of a thing. And I like that kind of a gesture. But for my own work, I always, I can't bear to have things be precious objects unless I give them away. I send out things a lot to people. I send postcards or I make things for people. But I struggle with the kind of capitalist construct of it. And it helps that poets don't ever make any money anyway. And so I don't think that, I never entered into it thinking I shall be a poet because there's money in that. But so I don't ever think of what I'm doing as a product in that larger sense. But it's a really big problem and a kind of heartbreaking problem, I think, for a lot of people I know who do letterpress and have to charge money and can't. Oftentimes I think people will find a way to get copies of their books to people who love books but have not a lot of money to buy them because of that kind of fraught situation.
I'm thinking also, Craig, of some of your work that actually thinks about the material production of ink, for example, like all of the different processes to make ink that would then be printed on the page. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and I think that in some ways is going to be part of my answer, and that you in some ways I think already answered this one part of this with your question about the digital. I mean, there obviously there's a genre of artist books that are fine art productions that are multi-$1,000 books. That's one thing. They're interesting. It's its own world. But if we're thinking of the artist book, say, as something that projects your poetics, if I mean everyone here is on some kind of device looking at Zoom, you've got that device. Think about how the poem works there, or that piece which was for Xerox machine. And just records the material chemical properties of the ink and the paper. didn't steal it from the University of Utah. I was working somewhere else, but a lot of people have access to copy machines. A lot of people have access to, office supplies that they can steal. The artist book could be stapled and Xeroxed. I think it depends. I think it depends more about how you're thinking about the material, in the way that you could have a poem that doesn't have any fancy words in it, and it could still be a really good poem.
I want to kind of take Brenda's question, sort of add this into this mix of responses we're getting, because she also points out it's not potentially just about distribution, but how to get out of a very academic elitist track into more popular channels, so we could think about the financial elitism potentially. And there's an interesting paradox that you guys have all pointed out. Kathryn says anyone can make an artist book, which is true, but can anyone read an artist book? Is there another form of elitism inherent to the artist book around poetry, which is, as it challenges forms of reading, does it become something that maybe freaks people out, for lack of a better term? I'm curious about that with you, Nathan, because I find your work extremely accessible, but also very experimental in some ways. So I'm wondering how you navigate that line.
Yeah, I tend to think about that a lot as, again, the kind of expectations and impositions we bring to a, like, I think a lot of times it's the fact that you expect a poem to be doing a particular thing that maybe limits your ability to enjoy it. And so often, that's the thing that I'm working to actively combat when I'm talking about poetry. Like, poetry is not defined in a particular way. What happens on a page does not need to be defined in a particular way. And what a book is doesn't have to be defined in a particular way. Those definitions impose limits that hamper our ability to enjoy what might be there, and to enjoy the insight that we have into that, whatever is happening. But it is a really interesting thing. My first book has handwriting in it, and I had students who bought that book when I was teaching at App State University, and somebody came back to me and said, "Hey, Professor Hauke, somebody wrote in your book in the bookstore." And so then we, talked about, like, well, what's the sensation of handwriting in a book? Like, but again, the expectation that it wouldn't be there in the first place becomes in some ways the conversation. And like all of anything that I to go to material, like, there is a difference between handwriting and typing something up or reproducing it in that way. And so I think that's foundational for me. I've never started anything by typing. Like, it's always handwritten. It's usually handwritten and Xeroxed or whatever first. So there's a lot of things that happen. And I think showing that hand might be disorienting in some ways, because we're used to stepping in further down the line. But I think it's honest and something I want to welcome people into, I guess.
One of the things that's always surprised me with teaching is some of the texts that I think people would imagine as the most complex become the most interesting for students to engage with. So Thoreau by Susan Howe, which you showed earlier, or David Hinton's Fossil Sky Map, which is basically just a big map and you can pull it out. And it doesn't behave, as you were pointing out, thank you, it does not behave like a poem that we've been trained to read, but students that feel stymied with maybe a Shelley poem, weirdly, there's something about the artist book or these kinds of material poetics that sort of force the reader to be more democratically engaged, which is sort of like, well, how would you put these things together? Why would you look at this versus that? And there's no right answer, right? It's just sort of, it's an inviting the reader to be part of that assemblage. So yeah, please. Yeah.
Jump in really quickly. I brought my copy of Susan Howe's The Midnight, which was a really seminal book for me and changed the way I think about things. But when I first read it, I was really offended by some of the things she did to books that her ancestors had given her. And so I felt like really fraught about it. I really struggled with it. So I started writing things. This is probably the most written about page because she fixes a book that her great aunt gave to her, that her great aunt declares is a book only for her eyes only. And she fixed it with duct tape, and I was horrified and couldn't account for it. And so I wrestled with this book for a really long time. And I think like the initial pushing out that it did to me, and me kind of going back in and looking at it, the discomfort that the book gave me initially made it into one of the best books and most important books for me that I've ever read. And in fact, I got my job at Hobart and Williamsworth colleges on using a job talk where my thesis was Susan Howe wants me to write in my copy of The Midnight. And so I showed pictures of my pages where I've written all over and done all this stuff and kind of made my own little personal artist's book out of it. And you would never want to create art to make it easy on a first reading. You know, sometimes things might be difficult. Like the first time I taught Stein to students, I absolutely blew it because I assumed they would read it the way I did and just kind of giggle most of the time while they were reading it. And they didn't. They felt really alienated by it. And I felt like I'd let down one of my poetic heroes. And so I kind of refigured how to teach it. And rather than not teaching it, I changed the way I taught it so that it was more inviting, so people would be willing to do the work of wrestling with it. So you wouldn't want to ever kind of dumb things down to make it more immediately accessible, but help people into the difficult artwork so that they can make their own art book in the margins of it and have their own kind of personal interaction with it.
I like that. And what Nathan also adds is art is irritating. And maybe that's one of the greatest benefits of these kinds of projects, is to remind us that when we're in a literature classroom, we're not there to find just ourselves. We're there to be pissed off into some other form of ourselves we might not have ever imagined. We have to stop, unfortunately, but there is one question that if anyone can answer it very, very quickly. It's a great one. Since there is such an ongoing process of adaptation and revision between word and material content, production issues, et cetera, how do you know when you've done an artist book? Craig, you have a quick answer for that?
Well, I'm not quite sure how to read the done, but I've made an artist's book if I feel like it can't take a different form without being a different work. Which I think is the question. The other way would be, how do I know when I'm done with a book? And that might be the same answer. But like Nathan, I like to build constraints in so that I know when I'm going to be done before I start. But I think, yeah, if I've come up with something that can't be otherwise, then I've done it.
That's great.
Thoreau says it takes time and not technique to know the difference, which I love too. Like, to me, it's all about time goes by and I realize that whatever it is most likely done with me. And that's a form of some kind. Right?
Yeah, I love that too. Well, I hate to stop because it's such a fascinating conversation, but thank you all. Thank you all out there for your questions and your attention. The next session will be starting in 8 minutes. I've got to go. And it's online in Stanza. And if you're interested in this panel, multimodal poetry is this afternoon. You can register that utahpoetryfestival.com. Have a wonderful weekend and hope to see you on more panels. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, y'all.